Tonight on the Draft Beard podcast, we are going to do a mock draft for the 2025 NFL Draft pre-free agency. Hey guys, it's Joshua Klein of the Draft Beard podcast. Tonight we are going to do a mock draft pre-free agency. We're going to go through and do a mock draft from picks 1 all the way through 32 of the first round. So it's a 1-round mock draft. I want to do a mock draft that was maybe a little bit centered on the quarterback. The NFL tends to have an affinity to overdrafting the quarterback. It obviously is the most important position in this sport. And so I wanted to see, what would a mock draft look like if you typically overrated the quarterback a little bit in this draft. We know that this draft class, as far as the quarterback, is not as strong as previous years. Last year, any of these quarterbacks probably would be in the 6, 7, 8 ranked quarterback if they were all grouped together last year. So with that, we're going to get started. We're going to go ahead and use the PFF mock draft simulator. When I did my mock draft earlier to compile all this, I did use a consensus big board and no trades in this mock draft. So we're just going to go straight on through. And again, this is pre-free agency. I know we've had quite a lot of breaking news today with Myles Garrett re-upping with Cleveland and deciding that Super Bowl appearance maybe isn't as important as he really thought he wanted. Money talks. That's all I got to say. Devontae Adams signing with the Los Angeles Rams. My Detroit Lions releasing Za'Darius Smith. Who knows? Maybe they bring him back on a different type of deal without the void years attached that would have cost them over the next couple years. But we'll see. Free agency is going to get kicked off soon. So we're going to get started with this mock draft and we'll get going. We'll honor the draft here. No trades again. And I had the Tennessee Titans. I wanted to do a draft that didn't show them taking Abdul Carter with the first overall pick. Their general manager did come out and say that he was going to take a generational talent. And not that Abdul Carter, I don't see, is a generational talent. I just think Travis Hunter offers an ability that no other player offers in this draft, to be able to the possibility of being able to go 2 ways and maybe being getting the hype in Tennessee, maybe solving that wide receiver problem, also being able to play him at cornerback. If they're willing to let him try, then I could see Travis Hunter being that guy for the Tennessee Titans. I personally would probably lean towards Abdul Carter with the defensive end being such an important position in the NFL. Right up there, you have your quarterbacks, obviously, number 1. You can argue that the pass rushing defensive end was number 2. The line side tackle maybe being number 3. So based on positional value, I would lean more towards Abdul Carter. But this is that exercise that we want to have some fun with and kind of see where things would shake out if Abdul Carter didn't go number 1. I mean, Cleveland's on the clock. With Abdul Carter sitting there, you could easily take him and pair him up with Myles Garrett, and that would be an unbelievable duo in Cleveland. Maybe go back to the way they were a couple of seasons ago, where their defense was just so dominant, and it led them to the playoffs, even with an older Joe Flacco as the fill-in quarterback. But in this scenario, I wanted to do something a little bit different and see what they would do if they did take who a lot of people feel as QB number 1 and draft Cam Ward. So I have the Cleveland Browns taking Cam Ward at number 2, giving them hopefully a quarterback for the future with already signing Myles Garrett and not needing a replacement at the edge position for Myles Garrett, since they're obviously not trading him away when they've signed him to a $120-some million guaranteed deal. So number 3 on the clock is the New York Football Giants. And in this scenario, with knowing that Shane and Daboll are nearing the end of their tenure, if they don't succeed, the possibility on the rumors out there of signing a veteran like Aaron Rodgers and just having them basically switch locker rooms, I'm going to go with the New York Giants drafting Shedeur Sanders. I know that's not going to be a very popular pick. Just trying to play this out where teams elevate the quarterback because it's such an important position. Your opinions on Shedeur are what they are. They're going to vary across the board. Some are going to believe in him a little bit more. I've heard some teams maybe have him as QB1. But if you were to have a quarterback in this draft that might have a longer career, it's probably Shedeur over Cam. Higher floor, lower ceiling. Cam has a much higher ceiling than Shedeur Sanders, but the Giants missed out on not taking the quarterback last year. That's something I would have done. when you had quarterbacks right there, and so they went with Malik Neighbors. Imagine the situation they would be in this season if they already had one of those quarterbacks that came out last year, and this year you're sitting in the top 3, and you'd be wide open to take whatever position, and you wouldn't be forced into maybe needing that quarterback. Now at pick 4 in my mock draft, I decided to go a little bit different. You would think with Abdul Carter here, would that just be a sprint up the card pick for the New England Patriots? And I could see that. But when I'm trying to create this mock draft that is centric on either drafting the quarterback or protecting your existing quarterback, I think the New England Patriots in this scenario go with Armand Membu, who just had a spectacular combine, and you getting Membu to play the tackle position and just protecting Drake May, building from the inside out, not taking Abdul Carter, which leaves a very interesting position here in Jacksonville. Looking at Jacksonville's depth chart, they don't need an edge rusher. They already have 2 good ones, right? So I could see, hey, Abdul Carter is the best guy on the board. If I was allowing trades here, I think maybe you would see someone try to rush up to pick 4, pick 5 here. But in my scenario here, I decided that I'm not going to go with an Abdul Carter because where is he going to play? Who's he going to bump out? Instead, I go with one of my favorite players in the draft, and that's Mason Graham, a guy who had phenomenal college tape. He is one of my 3 players in this class that I feel are blue chip players. And that's Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter, and Mason Graham. So Jacksonville goes with Mason Graham at pick 5, which leaves Abdul Carter here sitting for the Raiders. And I think pairing Abdul Carter with Max Crosby over the next few years would just be dynamite. Everyone says, hey, let's go with Genty, the running back out of Boise State. You are seeing that pick up more after the Geno Smith trade. But in this scenario, having Abdul Carter absolutely fall to your lap, I think this is where the Abdul Carter quote unquote slide stops, and the Raiders take Abdul Carter at pick 6. So that leaves me at pick 7. And being a Lions fan, I'm a big fan of Aaron Glenn and what he did with the Detroit Lions defense. I know a lot of teams are out there saying, hey, they're going to get Tyler Warren, the tight end. Their defense is in pretty good shape. But I think in this scenario that the Jets go and try to do what the Lions did, right? Build from the trenches out. Their defensive line is pretty good. I know this will be a reach on the mock draft PFF's board, but I think Calvin Banks is the best tackle in the draft, not counting the injuries concerns here to Josh Simmons. So looking at pick 7, maybe the Jets can move down. Again, this mock draft is not going to be doing any trades, but I have the New York Jets pairing up with Olu Fashanu and getting another tackle. Their interior offensive line has been improved over the last couple of seasons. So are the Jets going with Calvin Banks Jr. Carolina is a team that desperately needs defensive line help. And right here, I think they go with the edge defender out of Texas A&M, who's just vaulted up draft boards, has had an unbelievable process in the draft process here. I know he doesn't have a lot of quote unquote production, but when you watch him on film, he's very disruptive. He just needs to learn how to finish. He can play, I think, inside, he can play outside. And so I think Carolina solves one of their defensive needs here on the defensive line, whether it's edge or interior, and goes with Shamar Stewart. Next up on the clock is the New Orleans Saints. And I had the Saints taking the best offensive player on the board and going with Tyler Warren, the tight end out of Penn State, which then brings us up to the Chicago Bears. And Ben Johnson being the head coach there, they've done a good job at trying to address the guard need. I think trading for Joe Thuney is an excellent move for the Chicago Bears. I'm not so sure on the Jonah Jackson thing, watching him in at the end of his tenure with the Lions. And then last year, it just didn't work out with the Rams. He's hoping he can catch fire being with the familiar coach. So in this case, I go with Ashton Genty, the running back, going to the Chicago Bears in this scenario. I think Ben Johnson would have a lot of fun with him. I am a big Genty fan, and I think he is going to be a great running back. That'll be a great pick for the Chicago Bears. I'm not the biggest DeAndre Swift fan. Glad he left the Detroit Lions and he found out really quick in Philadelphia. Hey, they replaced him really quick just with Saquon Barkley, and you can see the same thing happening here. A much better back replacing Swift. Next up is the San Francisco 49ers. Without the injuries, they would never be picking here. They have a roster that is much better than what you see what the record indicated. And San Francisco needs some help on the interior of the offensive line. And so in my scenario, I went with a guy. I know he's listed as tackle, but he's not going to play tackle at the NFL level. He's going to be a guard, and he can help solidify the guard position. And that's Will Campbell out of LSU. Next up is the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys, they got needs at running back. They need another wide receiver besides CeeDee Lamb. I don't see another player here who is a tackle that could help fill a need at tackle. An edge defender, I could certainly see that with some of the edges on the board here. Kind of went back and forth and looking. Did Mike Green, Azaraku, does a guy like Michael Williams fit their system? Interior defensive line, all of those guys outside of the top tier, and Mason Graham still available. But I went a little bit out of the box, looking at their depth chart and going with a guy who had an absolute monster combine. He's had a great pre-draft process. It's one of my favorite guys in this draft, and a guy who can kind of maybe come up and play a little linebacker role for you and be a safety. And that's Nick Immanwori, the safety out of South Carolina. I think that screams kind of a Dallas Cowboys type pick, athlete, great RAS score. Then at 13, I think the Dolphins could also use a safety. They could also use some interior offensive line help. Again, is there that value here at pick 13? Defensive interior, would you take a guy like Kenneth Grant, Derek Harmon? What would fit? They also need a safety as well. I went with another guy, back-to-back safeties. I think there are 2 first-round graded safeties in this class, and Miami Dolphins going with Malachi Starks, bringing up the Indianapolis Colts on the board at 14. And I had them taking Will Johnson, the cornerback out of Michigan, instead of going with a guy like Colson Loveland. And I see a lot of mocks doing that. I was trying to do something a little different than what you see with popular picks paired up. So I went with cornerback. They do need a defensive back there. And Will Johnson, he didn't have a great 2024. Injured all year or most of the year, but I really like him. I think he can play as a really good zone corner, maybe can play man press. He just is really intelligent, and I think it's going to be a really good ball hawking cornerback. Next up, we have the Atlanta Falcons, and they need edge rushing help desperately. And so I went with Mike Green out of Marshall. Absolutely love that guy. Great college production. I think what the Falcons need pairs up well with where this draft stacks up, and it is a very good draft for edge rushers. Next up, the Arizona Cardinals. And so Arizona, also a team that could use some defensive line help. They run kind of that 3-4 with maybe some 4-3 mixed in. And I went with a guy that the NFL is a little bit higher on than I am, but I think he could fit and maybe play if they need a more base 3-4 end, or move him outside for a little bit on a 3-4. Sorry, base end on a 3-4. And if they're running a 4-3, be their traditional defensive end on a 4-3. And that's Michael Williams out of Georgia. I think he would be a great fit for the Arizona Cardinals. Kind of has that same feel with what they went last year when they drafted the edge rusher out of Missouri from my home area of Detroit, Michigan. So, and then the Cincinnati Bengals are on the clock next. And in this scenario, I went with getting them the beef. They don't have DJ Reader, who left last season, and getting some interior beef and an absolute specimen in Michigan's Kenneth Grant. That guy can absolutely fly. I think he's raw. I think he still needs some learning to do and with pass rush moves. But he has all the athleticism at that huge body frame. So I think they go ahead in Cincinnati in this scenario takes Kenneth Grant out of the University of Michigan. Next up is the Seattle Seahawks. This is definitely become a much more interesting scenario now with them trading Geno Smith. What are they going to do at quarterback? Are they going to try to trade up for a quarterback? They're going to draft. Are they going to not draft? Sorry. Are they going to sign or trade for? However, it's going to work with Sam Darnold from the Minnesota Vikings and move him over. They don't have great interior offensive line. Again, I don't see one here that is it worth the 18th overall pick? Maybe a Gray Zabel. I could maybe, but I think what they do here in this scenario with the way that the board fell is going with Tet McMillan out of Arizona. He kind of will replace DK Metcalf. Looks like he's going to be traded. So I went with the wide receiver, Tet McMillan, going to the Seattle Seahawks. And then at 19, I went with a guy who they have a desperate need, I think, at linebacker. And the best one on the board is Jihaad Campbell. I know I tried to stay away from picks that a lot of mock drafts seem to just gravitate toward, but I think this one is just the perfect fit for the Tampa Bay Bucks and getting a guy like Jihaad Campbell. Now, Denver, the Broncos are on the clock, another team who they could use maybe a wide receiver. They could use a linebacker, but with Jihaad Campbell going ahead of them, I don't see any of the other linebackers being an option here. They could use safety, but again, our 2 first-round graded safeties are gone. And in this case, I went with the best tight end on the board. It just screams Colston Loveland going to the Denver Broncos if he's available. I could see a running back too, but I just don't know if Sean Payton is going to use a first-round pick on a running back, especially in a class that is very deep. I know he's talked about getting a better at the wide receiver position, getting some more playmakers, but I don't know if Colston Loveland out of Denver. And that one I know is an obvious pick, but it just made too much sense. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, what is Pittsburgh going to do? You can look at quarterback. I've seen the whole Jackson Dart thing. I've seen maybe Shooter Sanders falling there. I see defensive back. Could they go with Jahadae Barron or a Ravel or getting another cornerback, especially with Cam Sutton being a free agent? They need a wide receiver, someone a little different, or you got George Pickens there. And in this scenario, I went with a guy, Luther Burden III, a guy that can use multiple ways. And he, I think that you could go any one of number of ways here at wide receiver. They're all kind of bunched up with Luther Burden III, Emeka Egbuka, Matthew Golden. I personally like Trey Harris is a great contested catch guy, but that wouldn't make sense for Pittsburgh. They already have that guy in George Pickens. So I went with Luther Burden III, which then brought me to the Los Angeles Chargers. And I went with Emeka Egbuka, the Ohio State wide receiver going to play for the former University of Michigan head coach, Jim Harbaugh. And so I went with Emeka Egbuka. I think he'd be a great pairing with Ladd McConkey and Quentin Johnson out there. I would rather have a taller contested catch guy out there besides Ladd McConkey, but I think that's a great pick. If Colston Loveland's there, I think that's the position that they go with. You might be able to get a tight end. I thought about running back as well, but again, this class is just so deep. I do think maybe one other team might jump up and grab a running back here in the first round, but I went with Emeka Egbuka. It's just kind of the way it fell. They didn't purposely pair an Ohio State guy with a Michigan head coach. But next up, that brings me to the Green Bay Packers. And the Packers have some needs, again, at wide receiver, but we all know the Packers don't draft wide receivers in the first round. Additionally, you had a couple go just in front of them. They're going to need some edge help. They also need help in their secondary. And I don't think that in this scenario that if Jahadae Barron or even one of the other corners like an Azariah Thomas or Ravel from East Carolina, I think they don't make the same mistake twice and pass on basically who is basically Brian Branch 2.0 and Jahadae Barron. So I went with Jahadae Barron going to the Green Bay Packers. And that brought me to the Minnesota Vikings. And so the Vikings, they've re-signed Aaron Jones today. They have some needs at running back, defensive interior. They could use some secondary help. You have some guys I like on the board that might work for them. I think Ravel would be a good fit. I really think Jahadae Barron would have been a really good pick there as well. But in this case, I said a team. I think another team is going to go and draft a running back in the first round. And I think Omarion Hampton is closer to Ashton Jeanty than a lot of people realize. And I have the Minnesota Vikings going with Omarion Hampton. In this scenario, I think Minnesota is really going to try to trade down. They don't have a lot of needs. They had a really good season last year, but I think they really need the draft capital for moving around in last year's draft to get Dallas Turner, to get JJ McCarthy. They're just left with a dearth of picks. So I'm going to go with Omarion Hampton here. At 25 is the Houston Texans. I know they picked up Christian Kirk, but I still think wide receiver is an absolute need for them. And with Matthew Golden, he's sitting here on the board for the Houston Texans. That might be a really good play, but I really think the play that really needs to happen for them is they got to protect CJ Stroud. And that offensive line was just brutal. And I'm going to end up, I looked at one of my favorite guys in this year's draft, and that's Gray Zabel out of North Carolina, or I'm sorry, North Dakota State. I absolutely love that guy. He definitely is probably going to play more inside. I think he could, in a pinch, play tackle. That gives you versatility to play all the positions along the offensive line. I think he helps upgrade their offensive line. So I went with Gray Zabel to the Houston Texans in this scenario. Again, utilizing that mentality in this particular mock draft that we want to look at how can we protect the quarterback or kind of overvaluing that quarterback based on where they really are on the draft board. Next up is the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams just brought in Devontae Adams. They need a tight end. I mean, they got some guys who get the job done, but they don't really have a really good tight end. The top two are off the board. I don't see that happening. The top linebacker is off the board. Do they go corner here? I could see that. There's still some guys I like, as I previously mentioned with Thomas and Ravel, and I like Trey Amos as well. But in this case, again, I went with Josh Conerly Jr., the tackle out of Oregon. The guy, I believe, only allowed 2 sacks over the last few years. He will upgrade the offensive tackle position. I know they had some injury concerns this year at a lot of their offensive line. And I think upgrading that offensive line, getting a guy like Conerly Jr. To protect Matthew Stafford over the next few years is a home run for them. I think the way this draft board fell, that works for them. Next up is the Baltimore Ravens. And the Baltimore Ravens need some edge rush help, maybe a little bit of cornerback. I know they drafted a couple last year. I don't see another tackle. Maybe I could see them going with Josh Simmons here. But in this scenario, I went with the edge rush help because I believe that in their scheme and in their system, this particular guy who fell down their draft board, where did I put it? Let's search here. I went with Jalen Walker out of Georgia, that edge linebacker. He's listed as linebacker. He's really better at the edge, and I think he could fit really well in a 3-4 outside linebacker role. Use him as kind of an edge at times, use him as a Sam linebacker at times. So I think he would fit what the Ravens do. I think that fits just perfectly. Next up, the Detroit Lions. As you can tell, huge Lions fan. And so everybody knows they have massive, massive needs on the edge. Interior defensive line is also a little need with Lee McNeil being out with an ACL. So, and a guy like DJ Reader's only under contract for 1 more year. So you could use another defensive tackle. Levi Onwuzurike, he's a free agent. They have not brought him back as of this recording. And they did let Za'Darius Smith go. The edge is really a screaming need. Other needs they have on their team, interior offensive line. If they don't re-sign Kevin Zeitler, they're going to need another guard. I think Christian Mahogany can step in and play right guard very well. They need a replacement really for Graham Glasgow. I think he fits better as a backup. See that being a need here, pick here. Linebacker, and PFF has it listed out. Know if that's really that big of a need. They're actually pretty deep at linebacker. They did just re-sign Derek Barnes. But again, remember, Brad Holmes is going to draft best player available. And I think in this particular, where the way the board fell, I ended up going with Nick Scorton, the edge out of Texas A&M. I think his body style and what you saw him at Purdue as opposed to what you saw at Texas A&M fits what they're looking for out of their defensive ends as opposed to a Donovan Ezeraku. I don't think a guy like James Pierce Jr., it fits the Detroit Lions at all. In terms of what I've heard about character, the coachability, some of the rawness to his game. I do think the interior defensive line here that was available, I could see them easily jumping on Darius Alexander out of Toledo or Derek Harmon or Walter Nolan. I think all 3 of them. I ended up going with Nick Scorton in this slot and seeing what he can bring to help with the Lions. Again, they go with best player available. It just so happens that this draft is so heavy on positions that they actually need. And I went with Nick Scorton out of Texas A&M. The Washington Commanders are on the clock, and I went with James Pierce Jr. Again, I do think a guy, if he's given good coaching and he's willing to accept that coaching, I think he can excel. I think Washington would be a good place for him to land, and that's where I went with James Pierce. I personally like the player. I just don't think he fits with what the Lions would do, and that's why I didn't take him there. And so I went with James Pierce to the Washington Commanders. The Buffalo Bills are on the clock. They need some interior defensive help. They maybe need some pass rush help, some wide receiver help. And so with the Buffalo Bills, now I looked at wide receiver. You've got Matthew Golden. I looked at corner, and on the board, you have got guys like Azareye'h Thomas. Let's just cut off and go with just corners here on the board. Maxwell Harrison is a guy I considered. Siobhan Revell is a guy I considered. Azareye'h Thomas. I'm higher on these guys than Darian Porter. I did consider going that way, but in the end, I ended up going with Matthew Golden being here. A lot of people will have him maybe as wide receiver 1 or 2. I think there's a bunch of wide receivers that are kind of tiered up together. Some will have Tet McMillan. You got Matthew Golden. You've got Luther Burden III. You've got Emeka Buka, Trey Harris. You got the Iowa State guys. I think there's just a lot of guys that are kind of that second round or maybe borderline first round grade, maybe, but just a bunch of those second round graded wide receivers. There's just not an elite receiver. That's why a lot of people have this draft class. They're a little down on it. I'm a little higher on it than most, but I think there's going to be some really good starters. I just don't think there's that true wide receiver 1 Pro Bowl type receiver. Just a lot of good wide receiver 2. So I with Matthew Golden going to the Buffalo Bills. And then this one was an easy pick. I took about 2 seconds to make this pick when it fell this way. It's Josh Simmons, the tackle out of Ohio State. He should be tackle number 1, but due to the injury concerns, I think this would be a home run pick for the Kansas City Chiefs. And last but not least, the Philadelphia Eagles, and there's no University of Georgia player that fell in this draft scenario. So in this case, I went with them looking at what is the best on the draft board. I could have seen this going with Donovan Ezeraku. Any of these 3 interior defensive linemen, I think all of them would be great picks. Anybody on the interior, I don't think the best value is there. I don't know if Tyler Booker, who is on the interior, would be the best value and what the Philadelphia Eagles like to go with. So I ended up closing out the first round and going with Walter Nolen, the interior defensive lineman out of the University of Mississippi. So the Ole Miss Rebel, Walter Nolen. And that finishes up my mock draft here. I'm sure if you in the comments, I'll get a feel like, what were you thinking? But a lot of these mock drafts, a lot of them, they're just fun to do. Like play out different scenarios, just like real NFL teams do. They play out different scenarios to see who could fall, who might not be there, might be there, and running it in your head, because you just never know what can happen in the NFL draft. And you're a guy that's fallen, you never expected it. You didn't play out that scenario. You don't want to be caught, in the sand or just flat footed. So again, this is my first mock draft of the 2025 NFL season. And again, to recap just a little bit, Travis Hunter, Cam Ward, Shadur Sanders, Armand Membu, Mason Graham, and Abdul Carter, all going in the top 6. And no, the theme of this draft, again, was using the quarterback as the way the NFL views the quarterback, kind of overvaluing based on their positional value over where they actually fall ranked on the draft board. I don't think really in my wildest dreams I would ever see Abdul Carter actually falling all the way to number 6. If I was doing trades, I'm just one of these teams would gladly have moved down. I could see Jacksonville moving down. I could see the Patriots moving down a couple spots and still getting the offensive lineman that they would need to help protect Drake May, or just take Abdul Carter. But fun, a little exercise. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, share this with all your friends, and leave some comments in the comment about what your thoughts were about my pre-free agency NFL mock draft. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun just kind of messing around with it and doing it. And we'll figure out how to get my face up there a little bit later. But hey, thanks you guys so much for joining us tonight, and have a great night.
The Draft Beard Podcast.